So I would just formally like to say welcome to everyone. I'm Dan Lambert, and I serve this congregation as minister. Our progressive, welcoming, inclusive, and judgment-free congregation is a liberal religious community of diverse and free-thinking individuals. UUFC is a spiritual community where reason and social justice matter. As people who learn, love, share, and serve together, we welcome all into our family. We begin our service each week by singing an invitation to gather together, even as we are scattered in many different locations. So let's start by singing Enter, Rejoice, and Come In. Thanks everybody for singing. Ken Brennan is our worship associate today, and Ken will introduce us to the chalice lighting. Ken, go ahead and unmute yourself, please. Go ahead, Ken.
Okay, I've lost it, Ken.
The three
That already picked up
grandkids, nephew, just nobody's here to support. It's just really frustrating.
Love is the spirit of this fellowship, and service is its goal. This is our aspiration, to dwell together in peace, to seek truth and love, and to help one another.
If you have a chalice at home, we invite you now to take a moment and light that candle or light or whatever you have beside you to join with us in our chalice light. We'll give you just a moment to do that before we move on. Now Ken has opening words for us. Ken, unmute yourself, please.
Our theme today has to do with people venturing to a new life. Scholar Joseph Campbell introduced the world to the heroic myth cycle. It's a universal theme wherein a person descends into hell, survives terrible challenges, then ascends to a new and comfortable life as a hero. In the short poem that follows, he describes how this applies to ordinary people on great voyages. Perhaps it applies to those early UUs who ventured to America. The Hero Path by Joseph Campbell. We have not even to risk the adventure alone, for the heroes of all time have gone before us. The labyrinth is thoroughly known. We have only to follow the thread of the hero path. And where we had thought to find an abomination, we shall find God. Where we had thought to travel outward, we will come to the center of our own existence. Where we had thought to be alone, we shall be with all the world.
I forgot to unmute myself that time. We are going to, in fact, talk today about Unitarians and Universalists coming to America and how each different faith was founded and got its start here on the land, and all the positives and negatives that come with that. Now, one of the other things that I've kind of struggled with during the past 5 months or so that we've been on Zoom is how to welcome new folks. You know, when we're together here in the sanctuary, we ask people to stand up and we bring a microphone and they introduce themselves and we applaud and say, oh yeah, I'm from New York too, and that kind of thing. It's just really hard to do that in this Zoom environment. And so I want to try something. I haven't actually looked at the whole list of everybody who's logged in today, but if you're new with us, meaning that you've only been with us on Zoom, you've never really been with us in person, I'd like for you to use the chat box if you would like to, if you feel safe to do that, and just say your name and where you're from and maybe how you heard about us. That way we can get to know you a little bit, and then later when we have a time for some social interaction, people can say hello and go, oh yeah, I'm from New York too. And try to create a little bit of a way to welcome our new visitors. So if you are new with us and have been maybe Zooming a few times
I'm zooming into
the past few months, then please go ahead and write a little bit of information in the chat box so that we know who you are and we can welcome you later in the service. So we invite you to do that. You can do that while we sing our hymn, in fact, which is The Silence in the Song. This is another offering that comes to us from our choir, and you'll see the lyrics on the screen, so we invite you to remain muted, but sing along at home. This is The Silence in the Song.
In winter stillness, the dance of spring begins. In summer's twilight, the autumn breeze blows in to every season. Both peace and pulse belong, so bound together, the silence and the song. Before the tender lullaby can soothe us with its sound, before the finest symphony can swell with notes profound, so we listen. In moments clear and calm, to hear with wonder the quiet strains from praise. So when we sing with voices pure and strong, the gifts surround us, the silence and the song, the gifts surround us, the silence and the song.
That was really wonderful. That was, in case you couldn't pick it out, that was Linda Hines doing all the different vocal parts on that. And of course, Jim Boyle playing the instruments. And then Linda put that all together to make the video. Sometimes, I know I always encourage everybody to sing along, but sometimes I catch myself listening and I forget to sing. And that was one of those songs where I just listened. It just sounded really wonderful. And I know I say this every week, but I cannot express enough how I appreciate the work that Jim and Linda and the other choir members are putting into our music each week. It certainly is helping us have that sense of togetherness that we miss in community by not being here in the sanctuary together. Speaking of community, we also each week are learning more about one of our members. And right now we're going through our worship associates. And today, since Ken Brennan is our worship associate, we're going to learn more about Ken. So Ken, we will spotlight you. Go ahead and unmute yourself and tell us all about your entire life story in 3 minutes or less.
This is my journey to Unitarian Universalism. I grew up with George Washington at the back door, by which I mean I was born and raised in historic Chester County, Pennsylvania, in a small town about 5 miles from Valley Forge. From this beginning, I developed a sense of history, an understanding of the high values on which the founding fathers hoped to build a new nation. The first day of first grade, my mother had to drag me, kicking and crying, the 2 blocks to our elementary school. But in just one day, I fell in love with Miss Kotz and the whole idea of school. In fact, the learning environment would be home to me for the next 25 years. And my parents would often wonder if they could drag me out of that life and have me get a real job. I also lacked physical coordination and I always lacked physical coordination, and never developed an ability or interest in sports. This was a big disappointment to my dad, but it meant my world was the much wider kingdom of the mind. My mother was a Roman Catholic, the daughter of Hungarian immigrants, devoted to the Eastern Orthodox religious tradition. My father and my beloved grandmother on his side were devout atheists. So while my mother assured that I made the obligatory trips to Catholic Mass and confession, there was a healthy amount of sniping on the sidelines. As a youngster, I accepted the Articles of Faith prepackaged for me by a 2,000-year succession of holy scholars. But I attended public, not Catholic school, so I developed an understanding that even within Christianity, there was some diversity and of opinion and belief. Early on, I enjoyed the rituals of Catholicism, but with passing years, they meant less and less to me, as did the mysteries of the faith. I enjoyed confronting the mysteries of everyday life because they had logical solutions and I could learn something. But I didn't want mysteries in anything as important as my religion. My first big venture was to Temple University, where I made friends with Jewish classmates who got along just fine without invoking Jesus to get them to eternity. This was when I did my first exploration of Unitarianism in Joseph Priestley's historic church in Philadelphia. Then graduate studies in the physical sciences claimed all my attention until 1974. Then I found myself in a new job in Minnesota with a wife and 2 loving daughters in elementary school. When my older daughter came home crying because the other kids told her she was going to go to hell because we didn't go to church, I knew it was time to act. Then Pat and I had a real miracle. We discovered Michael Servita's Unitarian Society less than a mile from our home. We checked it out and found welcoming, intelligent folks who actually lived in our neighborhood. We discovered not just a spiritual home, but new friends, some of whom I'm connected to 45 years later. Becoming a UU didn't assure my happiness in life any more than any other belief system. I've known the joy of marriage and the agony of divorce twice. I'm sure I wasn't always a great father. But as a UU, I know I am not at the mercy of a capricious, punitive God demanding obedience in return for an unproven eternal life. I know that I am responsible for my own inner life. I know that I am connected to rational, caring, spiritual people like you.
Thank you so much, Ken. And we're actually going to talk some about the names, some of the names and places that you've mentioned in the message coming up in a few minutes. Now, as we move into a time where we share the Book of Life and have a moment of silence, I just want to acknowledge some of the events of the past week and how difficult it's been in our culture, how difficult it's been for some of us emotionally. Maybe you even have connections to people who live in Kenosha. I have a former student who is a pastor at a Lutheran congregation in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where, of course, earlier this week, a man by the name of Joseph Blake was shot 7 times in the back by a police officer. And there have been protests and rioting and all kinds of news coverage and deaths that have come in the wake of that. And that's been on top of so many other protests and shootings and deaths that have come to the Black community throughout this year. It just keeps compounding one after another, and it takes a toll on us, and I want to acknowledge that. Also, the 2 weeks of political conventions wrapped up this past week with the Republican National Convention and all of the speeches and events and drama that came along with that. We had not 1 but 2 hurricanes come up through the Gulf and devastated parts of Texas and Louisiana that we have to acknowledge as well. The lives and the property and the UU congregations that were in the path of those storms. Of course, we continue to deal with the pandemic, which is why we're live on Zoom this morning and not here in the sanctuary spread out as we normally would be, enjoying one another's company and laughter and shaking hands and sharing hugs. And then I also want to recognize that here in Charlotte County, anyhow, school starts tomorrow. And for about 80% of the parents in the Charlotte school system, they've chosen for their children to go to school in person. And we don't know how that's going to turn out. We're not really sure what to expect. And we want to recognize that we want to not only lift up the students in the coming weeks, but also the teachers, the staff, the administrators who will be dealing with at a very uncertain time in the classrooms, in the buildings, in the hallways. There's a lot going on. Yesterday, I had a chance to have an email exchange with Stephanie Garrett, who most of you know as a longtime member, past president of UUFCC, and we were talking about a request I had made of her And she was telling me about how her week has been challenging in a couple of different ways. And I asked her permission to share with you because this informs the fact that these things that we see on TV, the riots and the images and the bigotry and the victims that we see on the news are real, and they impact people that we know and love. Stephanie shared this. A few days ago, over leaves rustling down the middle of our street, which the wind blows into a meadow 200 feet away, our neighbor of 20 years, who lives across the street from us, called my husband a nigger and a monkey out of nowhere and for no apparent reason. We had been cordial over the years. A few weeks ago, we noticed 13-star Betsy Ross era flag, which is now used by white nationalists, flying at his house. No worries, it didn't hurt us. My husband responded appropriately. F you, he yelled, and walked away. We are safe with many white allies, including Trumpers in our neighborhood. We are in a 95% white area with no history of racial tension. I am past president of our 500-member Property Owners Association. The neighbor who said these things has never been a member. Racism is ignorance, insecurity, and jealousy. My husband reminds me never to be too comfortable. When I asked Stephanie if I could share this, her response was, go for it. Tell folks not to feel sorry for me. Tell them I will feel sorry for them if they don't speak out against all of the isms, starting in their own community. You should never feel comfortable in the face of hate. My other neighbors, friends, and members of my exercise class were shocked. The vast majority of these white people have little or no contact with others and think that those issues only happen someplace else. My Zumba teacher, who is Mexican, and another friend of mine who is Iranian are both naturalized citizens and have had similar experiences. Like me, they are also well connected with white allies and not afraid to speak up. She concluded our email exchange Saturday with this quote from the late Congressman and social justice leader, John Lewis. If you see something wrong, say something. Stephanie adds, silence is complicity. Enough is enough. So as we go into a moment when you have a chance to share your joys and concerns in our chat room, you can just type something that might be on your mind or on your heart, something about you or a family member or a friend. It might be health related or society related, whatever it might be. Something that you would like to share with us that we can share in your joy or we can share in your burden. As a community, this is what we do. We share one another's burdens. We laugh with one another. We cry with one another. We hug one another, even sometimes though those hugs have to be virtual, such as today. So we'll give you a moment. You'll hear an instrumental that Jim put together called Musings on COVID. And we'll put something on the screen, and we'll give you about a minute and a half or so to write what's on your mind in the chat room. And then we'll have a moment of silent meditation after that. So please go ahead and take this time to write in the chat room. Thank you all for sharing. As you can see, we do have both some joys and some concerns in our community, which is typical for our week. That's just how we do as a community. Now I invite you to take a moment of silence. It's rare in our lives that we take time just to be quiet and to be still. That can be so refreshing for our souls, for our spirits, for our minds, for our hearts. And a minute isn't nearly enough, but at least it's something. So during this minute, I invite you to think about the things that are happening in your life. I invite you to think about our new friends that we're meeting who are joining us on Zoom, about the concerns that I shared, the joys and concerns that others have shared. But also think about yourself, how to center yourself in a place of contentment and joy, or maybe to center yourself in a place of action as a result of what you've been hearing on the news and what Stephanie has shared. So let's have a moment of silence at this time. You'll hear a ding on the bell, and then we will sing Spirit of Life together. Let's enter a moment of silence, please.
Spirit of life, come unto me. Sing in my heart, O servants of compassion, who call in the wind, rise in the sea, move in the land, giving life, shape of justice, roots holy grows, we set free. Spirit of life, come to me, come to me. Spirit of life, come unto me. Sing my heart, O servants of compassion, Lord in the wind, rise in the sea, move in the hand, give life, shape of justice, roots holy grows, wings set free. Spirit of life, come to me, come to me.
Now we come to the time in the service where we would typically be passing these baskets up and down the rows and making sure nobody was taking money out of it, but putting money in instead. We are still needing your offerings to help pay our bills and to do the ministry work around the community that we're so still actively engaged in. So you can give in a number of ways. You can mail your checks here to our physical location. Mary Jane, our office administrator, is in a couple days a week making sure that things are okay and keeping track of the offerings and things like that. Your bank also has an auto pay option, which is what Tess and I do. With our pledge, we have it mailed regularly and we don't have to do anything. The bank just does it automatically. Or if you have a smartphone, you can use the Venmo app to make a donation. And if you're giving for a special offering, please make sure that you note that in the memo line or in Venmo. There's a way that you can make a note or a message for that as well. Thank you all for continuing to give. We're doing good with our budget, and always are very appreciative of the generous nature of our congregation. So thank you all. For a couple of months, we're spending time talking a little bit about Unitarian Universalist history. And the fact is that we're doing this in some ways to help me prepare for a big interview that I have coming up with our Boston headquarters with a group called the Ministerial Fellowship Committee. And that's coming up in about a month. And to help me prepare, I'm doing this series of messages as I read and study. And so you get the benefit of my study as well. What maybe all of you don't appreciate is the fact that I'm kind of a history nerd and I really enjoy this stuff. And if you don't enjoy history as much as I do, I'll still try to make it interesting and obviously make some important connections for us. But this week we're talking about the time when Unitarians and Universalists came from Europe to America and how both of those Christian denominations at the time took hold and spread and grew, and some of the theological and social implications of that. The fact is that Unitarians and Universalists used to rub elbows with some pretty important movers and shakers in history. In fact, many movers and shakers were Unitarians or Universalists, at least in their theology, if not formal church membership. As settlers came to the New World to pursue a life of freedom and wealth, and to escape persecution and poverty in Europe, the rapidly growing population of America was taking shape socially and religiously. And Unitarians and Universalists were at the forefront of that expansion in every way. You've already heard the name today as Ken shared a little bit about his story of Joseph Priestley. Joseph Priestley might not be a name that you know, but you are familiar with some of his work. In the mid-1700s, Priestley was an English chemist, a natural philosopher, a separatist theologian, a grammarian, a multi-subject educator, and a liberal political theorist who published over 150 books. He has historically been credited with the discovery of oxygen, having isolated it in its gaseous state. Since that time, we know that maybe one or two other people a year or so before he did this should be credited with that discovery. But still, you'll find him in science history books. He's also invented a drink that you might be enjoying right now. And no, I don't mean coffee, but I mean carbonated water. If you're drinking a soda or a pop, depending upon what part of the nation you're from, the carbonation in that, or maybe you're having a glass of champagne that's also carbonated, which is okay because especially during a pandemic, it's 5 o'clock somewhere and it's 5 o'clock basically all the time. But he invented carbonated water that people then began to use as drinks. Priestley's science was integral to his theology. He consistently tried to fuse Enlightenment rationalism with Christian theism. Priestley shared the liberal religious and political philosophy of many America's revolutionary leaders, including Benjamin Franklin, whom Priestley met at a Unitarian church in London in 1771. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson also became his friends and correspondents through the years. In Priestley's metaphysical text, he attempted to combine theism, materialism, and determinism. He believed that a proper understanding of the natural world promoted human progress and eventually would bring about the apocalyptic Christian millennium that was the Christian hope for quite a long time. Priestley, who strongly believed in the free and open exchange of ideas, advocated toleration and equal rights for religious dissenters. And he numbered himself among that group of dissenters. And ultimately that helped him to found Unitarianism in England at the time. The controversial nature of Priestley's publications, combined with his outspoken support of the French Revolution, aroused public and governmental suspicion. He was eventually forced to flee to America in 1791 after a mob burned down his home, his church, and his laboratory. He spent his last 10 years of life in Northumberland County, Pennsylvania, where he helped to establish some Unitarian congregations in that area. Despite such a strong European connection, Unitarianism as we know it in North America is not really a foreign import. It didn't just bounce from England to America. In fact, the origins of our faith in this country began with some of the most historic congregations in the Puritan New England age, where each town was required by law to establish a congregationally independent church that followed Calvinist doctrines. We'll learn more about that and some of the heresy involved with that next week when we talk about heretics, which is a great topic. About the same time, groups of conservative Christian pastors and leaders were calling for the revival of very conservative Puritan orthodoxy. A large number of people who opposed the revival, believing in free human will and the loving benevolence of God, eventually became what we call Unitarians and Universalists. During the first 4 decades of the 19th century, literally hundreds of these churches that had been established as Calvinist congregational churches fought over the ideas of sin and salvation, and especially over the doctrine of the Trinity. Most of the churches split over these issues. In 1819, Unitarian minister William Ellery Channing delivered a foundational sermon called Unitarian Christianity and helped to give Unitarians a strong platform and a foundation for our faith that still rings strong and true today. 6 years later, the American Unitarian Association was organized in, of course, Boston. While in many ways the connection between England and the colonies was strong religiously, American Unitarianism developed in its own unique ways. For example, one large Episcopal church in Boston had revised its prayer book, which was very conservative and very Calvinist, in the year 1785 to reflect a more Unitarian theology. But even most liberal American churches didn't go so far at that time, and few were influenced by such changes by large churches. The Unitarian movement in America then was largely native to American soil, and it was in the New England congregational churches that American Unitarianism first arose. Indeed, many of the older Unitarian churches in Massachusetts still retain their original Congregationalist names. These New England churches had a twofold origin. The Pilgrim Church at Plymouth and its neighbors in the colony were separatists. They wanted to separate from that strong Calvinist theology. They wanted to create their own colonies. Their earliest members had sojourned in Holland when a heretical theology called Socinianism was just coming to make some impression there. That was a theology that rejected the deity of Jesus and sinfulness of mankind. For some reason, these conservative Dutch Christians showed a tolerant spirit when it came to this, and they made the progression of Unitarian and Universalist theology for the early Pilgrim settlements something that was easier to do. Yet another influence that led to American Unitarianism and Universalism grew from Germany's radical pietism of the day. A female philosopher influential in radical pietist Christianity named Jane Lead, whose religious views were based on the thought of German theologian and mystic Jacob Boehme, plus her own visions and dreams, articulated the idea of the ultimate reconciliation of God, of all human beings, including the devil and his demons. That is one branch of German Universalism that wound up making its way to America. A preacher by the name of George de Benneville, a French Universalist who had gone to Pennsylvania in 1741, brought these theologies into contact with other groups in the New England area and affirmed universal salvation. So we see a connection there. Yet a different view of universalism appeared in the work of Welsh revivalist preacher James Relly, who presented scriptural text as teachings, and he believed that the teaching was the theology of universal salvation and that the salvation of every person is assured. Christ's unity with all human beings and his acceptance of the guilt and endurance as punishment for sins of humankind ensured that among the elect for whom Christ had suffered and died was the entire human race. Add to that popular British Methodist preacher John Murray. He set out to refute Raleig's views, but instead became convinced of their truth and took his theology to New England in 1770. His church in Gloucester was the first American Universalist congregation. Universalism continued to develop in America in at least 3 distinct geographical locations. Some of the earliest preachers of the gospel of universal salvation appeared in what were later Middle Atlantic and Southern states. By about 1781, a guy named Ellen Winchester had organized a Philadelphia congregation of Universalist Baptists, which of course today Universalism and Baptist would never be used together. Among its members was Benjamin Rush, the famous physician and one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. At about the same time, in rural interior sections of New England, a small number of itinerant preachers began to disbelieve the strict Calvinist doctrines of eternal punishment. They discovered that from their own independent biblical studies, a new revelation of God's loving redemption for everybody. From its beginnings, Universalism challenged its members to reach out and embrace people whom society often marginalized. The Gloucester Church included a freed slave among its charter members, which was incredibly unusual for the time. And the Universalists became the first denomination to ordain women to ministry, which happened in 1863 with a female minister named Olympia Brown. Universalism was a more evangelical faith than Unitarianism. After officially organizing in 1793, the Universalists spread their faith across the eastern United States and throughout Canada. A guy by the name of Hosea Ballou became the denomination's greatest leader during this period and spread Universalism far and wide. Other preachers followed the advice of Universalist publisher Horace Greeley, whose name may sound familiar, and went west to expand their message. One such person was Thomas Starr King, another well-known name in Unitarian Universalist circles. King is credited with defining the difference between Unitarians and Universalists this way. He said, Universalists believe that God is too good to damn people, and the Unitarians believe that people are too good to be damned by God. Universalists believed in a God who embraced everyone, and this eventually became central to their belief, and that lasting truth is found in all religions in some way, and that dignity and worth are innate to all people, regardless of sex, color, race, or class. A little before the middle part of the 18th century occurred a religious movement which caused the beginning of the split in many of these Calvinist churches especially. The Great Awakening, as it became known, was one of the most remarkable revivals of religion in Christian history. It began in Western Massachusetts under the preaching of Jonathan Edwards, who may be best remembered for his preaching about the terrible fate of what he called sinners in the hands of an angry God. Many preachers today, in fact, still preach on that theme, and some of us grew up in churches where we heard that message over and over and over again and created fear of whatever God might exist. That revival spread far and wide, continuing for several years and excited attention even in England. The consequence was that in 1740, the Reverend George Whitefield, a young English revivalist of the more extraordinary eloquence, was invited to come to New England to preach. Everywhere he preached to the crowds, they were too big for churches to hold. And in Boston Common, it was estimated more than 20,000 people attended one of his services. Together with all the good that resulted from it, 25 to 40,000 people were estimated to have been converted to Christianity during this time. The revival was marked by great emotional excitement, intense fanaticism, narrow bigotry, and extreme Calvinism. Those things became worse under the preachers who followed Whitefield. People of education were scandalized, and many of the leading clergy felt bound to oppose the revivalists and their methods. It was no wonder, because Whitefield had spoken of the New England clergy as dumb dogs, half devils, half beasts, spiritually blind and leading people to hell. Well, the reaction from the Great Awakening cost Edwards his pulpit eventually. And while many independent thinking Christians set their mind against this, it affected the strict Calvinism and that theology that Whitefield had sought to revive. The orthodox doctrine of the atonement and the pervasive Christian theology of predestination were increasingly criticized. There was a growing demand for more simplicity, for more reason, and for more tolerance in religious beliefs, a perfect ground for Unitarianism and Universalism to grow. You would think that with this theological tolerance and the preaching about the worth of every human, that the Unitarians and the Universalists would have taken a strong stand against the expansion of European Christianity to the Native American tribes. Unfortunately, this was not the case. In fact, UUs played some significant roles in attempting to proselytize the tribes and convert them to what was considered a more civilized way of life. One example was a group called the Society for Propagating the Gospel. The Society's objectives was the dissemination of Christian knowledge and the means of religious instruction among all of those in their country who were destitute of Christianity. The goal was to civilize and Christianize Native Americans, as well as economically disadvantaged whites, and eventually, after the Civil War, the mission included African Americans as well. The Society assumed that assimilation into mainstream white culture was morally improving them. When writing the history of the Society, Samuel Atkins Elliott noted that many of the original members were liberal Christians who were themselves Unitarian. After the Civil War, the American Unitarian Association accepted leadership over some Colorado Indian reservations. In 1870, President Ulysses S. Grant invited Protestant denominations to take over the management of American Indian reservations and agencies. His hope was that this would move to cut down on reported government corruption while simultaneously helping to civilize the Indians. The American Unitarian Association accepted the charge of the district covering the Colorado Reservation occupied by tribes of the Utes, consisting of about 8,000 Utes. 4 Unitarian ministers were assigned to work with the Utes at White River in the north and at Los Pinos in the south. Their primary mission, as reported in the American Unitarian Association's 1877 yearbook, was to maintain a strictly honest administration of government affairs and to meet the Indians in a humane Christian spirit, saving them from trickery, robbery, intemperance, and the vices of frontier life, and to present to them the better phases of Christian civilization. Well, the Unitarians were a large failure in this effort and did not bring the Utes into American Christian culture, as was their charge and their goal. Their actions may have been well-intentioned at the time, but were ultimately not welcomed by the Utes and were unproductive. They were ineffective, wrote one UU historian. They didn't begin to understand the culture of the people they were working with, and a succession of agents failed both in terms of government policy at the time and by participating in what we would see in hindsight as cultural imperialism. During the opening worship service of General Assembly in the year 2009, which was held in Salt Lake City, UUA President William Sinkford offered a formal apology to the Utes on behalf of the association for the past crimes against their people. He said, "We participated, however ineptly, in a process that stole your land and forced a foreign way of life on you. He said, we ask your forgiveness and we promise to stand with you and chart your way forward." Forrest Cooch, a member of the Ute Indian tribe and executive director of the Utah Division of Indian Affairs, and Ute elder Clifford Duncan attended this worship service. Cooch accepted Sinkford's apology and welcomed the General Assembly to Utah, and Duncan offered a prayer in the Ute language. Again, however, in the year 1909, Unitarians were involved in another ill-conceived project to convert Native Americans. President William Howard Taft, himself a Unitarian, appointed American Unitarian Association President Samuel Atkins Elliott to the board of the Indian Commission. In that capacity, Elliott gave addresses titled such as "From the Scalping Knife to the Can Opener," which argued how only assimilation to white culture would save Native Americans from their own barbarism. Elliott believed that liberal Christianity was an appropriate vehicle for teaching Native Americans to have a better character. He once said, "Indians must be first trained to the strength of will and steadiness of purpose. He must be accustomed to participate in the life of a community which acts under a better moral idea." You can see how appalling these words and ideas are to us today. Even with what we believe to be enlightened theology, Unitarians and Universalists went along with much of the majority strategy to change Native American culture to become more white and more Christian, which to these leaders also meant more civilized. The journey of Unitarianism and Universalism from a European Enlightenment heresy to accepted American Protestant theology took many different roads. It was not one simple linear trajectory. Different theologies and pastors from different areas came to the same conclusions at about the same time. The theological propositions that God is one, not three, that all people are inherently good and worthy, and that a loving God would never damn any soul to hell, all percolated and took root in the early years of American culture. We also have to own the fact that many of our own Unitarian and Universalist forebears made poor decisions and had terrible theology when it came to westward expansion and the evangelization of Native Americans. UU history is a living, breathing organism with a truth all its own. May we all keep in mind that 100 years from now, Unitarian Universalists of the 22nd century will look back on the year 2020 and pass judgment on our actions and our inactions. As the words of our longtime member Stephanie Garrett implored us earlier in this service, starting with the words of John Lewis, "If you see something wrong, say something. Silence is complicity. Enough is enough." May we learn the lessons of yesterday as we strive to create a better tomorrow. Amen and blessed be. Ken has our closing words. Unmute yourself, Ken, please.
There we go. For our closing today, we have a short poem. It's one I've always known some of the lines to, but I never knew the whole poem until recently. It was written by a young Jewish American woman whose family came from Europe. She understood the stresses of those traveling to escape tyranny of one sort or another, of those desiring to find a better way of life. She begins with a reference to the ancient Colossus of Greece, a huge statue symbolic of military might and victory. The New Colossus by Emma Lazarus. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs, astride from land to land. Here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name the mother of exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door.
Thank you, Ken. And now I invite you to join us as we extinguish the chalice. And now we extinguish this chalice, but not the light of hope, the fire of commitment, or the warmth of community. May those ideals shine in our lives and warm our hearts until we are together again. Just a few notes that I'd like to share as part of our life of the community this morning. First of all, a last reminder or a last invitation to sign up for Chalice Circles if you'd like to. Chalice Circles are our small group ministry where we have groups of 7 to 10 people or so who meet a couple times a month and talk about some aspect of a curriculum, but also just share and encourage one another. It's an intimate circle of people who will, of course, meet on Zoom for this year. And it's a confidential conversation. So anything you say in that group stays in that group. It's a very important opportunity for people to get connection, to be part of our community in a different way, and to learn to get to know some others. If you would like to be part of a Chalice Circle, even if you never have been in a Chalice Circle before, please send me an email today. Tomorrow I hope to begin to put some folks in groups and work with our leaders as we organize this. I already have about 25 people who have expressed interest, which is really great. So we're probably going to wind up with at least 3 groups for our Chalice Circles, which I think is pretty fantastic. I also mentioned last week that we have a couple of teachers that we have adopted, and we're supporting them as they begin school this week. There's a lot of extra expense that teachers have trying to make their classroom safe, trying to do online learning, and looking for some special resources for students. And so one teacher that we've adopted was looking for 100 copies of a book to use with her students. And we agreed to help provide those. Another teacher works with LGBTQ students, those who are struggling with that reality of their life in a school setting. And she asked for some resources, and we got a list of books. They're on the way, and they'll be part of the school library so that any student who is curious or interested in LGBTQ writings, books, and other resources will have access to that. So those things together cost us about $1,100, and so we invite you to send an extra check in to help us cover that expense. If you'd like to do that, just send a check or use Venmo or have your bank send a check. And in the memo line, just put teacher adopting or something like that so that we know what it's for. We do invite you after our final benediction to stay around for social hour, to chat, to get to know each other. Many of you have mentioned that it would be nice to use the Zoom feature called breakout rooms so that you could be in groups of maybe 6 to 8 people instead of a large group of 30 or 40. And we're working to figure out how to get that done. If you know how to do that in Zoom and you'd like to help us, please let me know, because we could definitely use some help when it comes to that. So as we end, let's sing together, Go Now in Peace.
Go now in peace, go now in peace. May the Spirit of us surround you everywhere, everywhere you may go. Go now in peace, go now in peace. May the Spirit of love surround you everywhere, everywhere.
As we end our service today, I remind you, as I do every week, to be a blessing to everyone you meet, whether you're in a restaurant or at a grocery store, at a drugstore, or walking in your neighborhood. These are times when we need to take special effort to spread joy and happiness to those we come in contact with. Think about the people that you live with who may also need that blessing, but also remember to be a blessing to yourself Give yourself some grace. This is a very difficult time and our emotions are on edge. And we're just tired of being cooped up and tired of life like this. And there doesn't seem to be any reasonable end in sight. And that makes things so much worse. So please be a blessing this week. Thank you for being here. We invite you to stick around for social hour where you can interact and have conversations with each other. Thank you so much.